Hi everyone, my name is Anna and I welcome you guys back to another English Torah video here on our channel of Jóvenes Peregrinando. Today's video is titled, The Rebel Sees the Promise from Afar and is Swallowed by His Sins, in which we are going to be focusing in chapters 15 and 16 from the book of Numbers. And in these chapters, we will be learning about the rebellion, which, as we all know, the rebellion, it is an act that leads the person to defiance, disobedience, or breach of authority. It is a characteristic of the human condition in which we find ourselves in, and it is also a behavior that mainly as young people we tend to adopt at some point in our lives due to a specific situation, and by acting in such way is that we are classified as rebels. This classification of rebels is considered a sin, which in Hebrew it is pesha, which comes from Hebrews 6588, and which means revolt, national, moral, or religious. Pesha, it is a defect, a fault, a fraud, infraction, iniquity, evil, offense, sin, rebel, rebellious, rebellion, betrayal, and transgression. This has to do with acting incorrectly even though we already have the knowledge and we know what the consequences are going to be after doing or acting incorrectly. So that is what we're going to be talking about in this video. And firstly, we're going to be focusing in chapter 15 about how the people of Israel, through their rebellion, saw the promise from afar. And at the same time, in chapter 16, we're going to be reading about how Korah and all of those who followed him were literally swallowed by the earth because of their sin or their rebellion that they had. And well, with this short introduction, verses 1 to 20 of chapter 15, it starts off with the Creator adding additional instructions to the korbanot, or offerings that the people of Israel were going to give or were going to offer to the Eternal. And as we have already studied in our previous Torah videos, the korbanot, or the offerings, were ways that the people of Israel would use in order to approach the Eternal, and which not only consisted of the blood of an animal sacrifice, but there were also other ways that the people of Israel would offer the Eternal these offerings. For example, some of them consisted of grain, the others consisted of bread, and all of these types of offerings, we can find them in Leviticus 7 verse 37. These offerings, as we have already studied, could be presented in not only holy appointments but also in votes, or they could also be presented voluntarily. But when presenting these, they had to, or in this case, in these verses from 1 to 20 of chapter 15, we can read that the Eternal says that when they were going to be presenting the offering, they had to add something else, and it all depended on the animal that they were offering and its number. For example, in these verses, it says that if a lamb was presented, then the person had to add the 10th part of an ephah of fine flour, as well as mixed with the 4th part of a hin of oil and the 4th part of a hin of wine for the alleviation. In the case of a ram, when a ram was presented, then it had to be added 2/10 of fine flour mixed with a 1/3 of hin of oil and the 1/3 part of hin of wine for alleviation, for the alleviation. And in the case of a steer, it had to be added 3/10 of fine flour mixed with half of a hin of oil and half of a hin of wine for the libation. It is important to understand that these offerings not only apply to those who were originally an Israelite, but also to the foreigners who had joined the people of Israel, who had adapted the faith that the people of Israel had, which was in the Creator, and lived with them. Within these verses, we can read that the Eternal says that these instructions that were added to the sacrifices would be for when they entered the promised land. And in this way, it is how they would be able to carry out these agricultural activities, since, as we all know, the promised land of the people of Israel was very fertile. As we have already studied in our previous chapters, the people of Israel were on their way, and they were in the desert on their way to the promised land that the Eternal had told them that they were going to possess. But however, the people of Israel once again rebelled against the Creator, regretting leaving Egypt, and they even started wishing for death because of how fortified the land was. And not just only that, but also because the giants that descended from Anak lived in that place that they were going, or in that land that they were going to possess. And because of this, it is why the Israelite people only got to see the promise from afar. And that is why that entire generation was going to spend the 40 years in the steppe. This caused that some of the Israelites lost the hope, but nevertheless, it still existed in some of the other Israelites, because the Creator did give them hope. He would not leave no inheritance, but however, he was going to fulfill his promise for the next 40 years. And although, yes, that generation was not going to be able to enter the land, but rather their descendants were going to be able to enter it. And there is where we can find that hope and importance of instructing them, or that is why the Eternal wanted the people of Israel to be instructed in obedience, so that they would not fall into a rebellion in which this generation fell in. From verses 21 to 31 of chapter 15, it talks about what would happen if someone from the people of Israel sinned unintentionally and did not obey the commandments of the Father. And in these verses, it says that if by accident, ignorance, or even by a mistake, the people of Israel did not carry out these instructions, then it was considered as a sin. But it could be redeemed with the corresponding offerings in order to redeem that person, or in the entire congregation, depending on who was the one, or who were the ones that committed a sin unintentionally. But when the entire intention was not fulfilled, even with the knowledge that they had, falling into arrogance and contempt, not only for the instructions but directly for the authority, the result of this was that they were going to be cut off from the congregation. In Hebrew, cut off, it is karat, which implied death for the person who acted in such a way. Continue with verses 32 to 36 of chapter 15, it says, "While the people of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. And those who found him gathering sticks brought him to Moshe and Aaron and to all the congregation. They put him in custody because it had not been made clear what should be done to him. And the Eternal said to Moshe, the man shall be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp. All the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him to death with stones, as the Eternal commanded to Moshe." And well, in these verses, we can read about a case of a man who apparently transgressed the Shabbat. And as we have already studied, the Shabbat can be stopped from keeping it only to fulfill a greater commandment, which is to preserve life. And we can also see that this situation also happened with the King David and even with the Messiah. Obviously in the case of the Messiah, he showed the importance of the Shabbat and giving it the correct interpretation. On the other hand, this man who is described in these verses stopped keeping it not because of some emergency, either it was a life or death situation, or to fulfill a greater commandment, but rather this man that we can read in these verses, he did not keep the Shabbos because he acted arrogantly by transgressing the Shabbat and also by gathering firewood on the day of rest, which involved work. And as we all know, the day of rest, it is not allowed to do any type of work. And as a result of that action that he did, it is why he was cut off from the people of Israel by being stoned to death by the whole congregation of Israel. And because of this man's act, it is why from verses 37 to 41, the Eternal tells Moses to do the following. It says, "The Eternal said to Moses, 'Speak to the people of Israel and tell them to make tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, and to put a cord of blue on the tassel of each corner, and they shall be a tassel for you to look at and remember all the commandments of the Eternal, to do them, not to follow after your own heart and your own eyes, which you are inclined to whore after. So you shall remember and do all my commandments and be holy to our Elohim. I am the Eternal, your Elohim, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your Elohim. I am the Eternal, your Elohim." And while in these verses, consequently, the Creator orders the use of tassels on their garments or on their clothing. This in Hebrew is called tzitzit, which comes from Hebrew 6734, which this has to do with the people that, as the verses say, they had to put these tassels or the tzitzits on their clothing. And this was so the people of Israel, upon seeing their borders or their tassels, would remember all the commandments of the Creator, and not just only remember them, but also put them to practice. And in this way, it is how they were going to be consecrated without falling into prostitution, by obviously letting themselves be carried away by appearances, according to what their eyes see, and also according to what their heart would feel. Which, as we all know, the heart can, in most cases, be misleading. And this is a teaching for us nowadays as believers, because in the same way as the people of Israel, we should not fall into a state of prostitution, being guided by our carnality in what we see and what we hear and what the impulses of the misleading heart wants us to do, reversing evil with good and obedience to the commandments that the Creator has written and has established in our hearts and in our minds. Just as we can read in Hebrews 10 verse 16 that says, "This is the covenant that I will make with them after those days, declares the Almighty. I will put my laws on their hearts and write them on their minds." Or also in Jeremiah 31 verse 33, it says, "For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Almighty. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their Elohim, and they shall be my people." Continuing with chapter 16, We're going to be reading how it is described about the rebellion of Korah, which in Hebrew, Korah comes from Hebrew 7141, and it has to do with the root karak, which means pluck and bald. This refers to the absence of hair, although yes, it can mean more than that, since let us remember that the hair within the scriptures refers to coverage, and in this case, this meaning refers to the lack of coverage, meaning that in the situation of Korah and his followers, they were not under the authority. They were not covered. Which at that time, the authority that existed for them was Moshe and Aaron. Since they were given that position by the Eternal. And in this case, in these verses, we can read that Korah rebelled against them, even though he belonged to the same tribe as them, which was the Levi tribe. And apparently, Korah wanted to take their place. Obviously, he allowed himself to be a product of the flesh, such as jealousy, envy, and greed. And they even gave a rise to this revolt, also that was not only made up by Korah and his followers, but also it was made up from Dathan and Abiram, who these two gathered more important people along with someone who also belonged to the tribe of Reuben. And it is inferred that this tribe of Reuben is the largest tribe and not being recognized as such. Instead, it was the tribe of Judah that gave rise to this type of jealousy and this type of greed that obviously led these people, by their carnality, it led them to participate in this revolt that was not only against the authorities that was directly given by the Creator, who had appointed these two men, Aaron and Moshe, for them to play these roles. These people, Korah, his followers, they went against what the Eternal had already said. So in this case, we can read that they did rebel against him and they wanted to take their place. As we know, the Messiah fulfilled these roles when he comes into this world, or when he came into this world. And as we have already studied, he was also the messenger of the Creator. But just as we can read in the time of Moshe and Aaron how the people of Israel was in rebellion and therefore they just rebelled against the Eternal, they didn't listen to Moshe and Aaron, so is the case in our days. Yes, the Messiah did come to fulfill these roles. Yes, he is the Creator's messenger. Yes, he is the path that we have in order to approach the Eternal. But however, the humanity is still the same. They still are inside this rebellion that obviously leads them to act in their or according to what their carnality wants them to act. With envy, with greed, with jealousy, and this is something that we as believers nowadays, seeing having this example of the people of Israel, how they would act, nowadays we have to see this and obviously not act the same way, but learn from there and know how to act correctly. Obviously, always obeying what the Eternal has said, and not wanting to go against what he has said. And in these verses of chapter 16, it also says that the total people who were supporting this revolt of Korah were 250 people. All of them believing themselves to be saints, supported by the fact that the Creator lived among them and making Moshe and Aaron look like they were interfering. But obviously, the Creator would demonstrate it in the following way. since Aaron and the 250 who followed Korah had to take censers. They had to put fire and incense to appear before the Creator, who would show who had been chosen. And the verses say that the next day, once they were ready to be or ready with their censers, then the Creator wanted to consume the entire assembly because of those people who rebelled against Him, against what the Eternal had already said. And it was clear that a judgment obviously was going to come, right? So there had to be a separation between those who followed Korah, Dathan, and Abiram from those who would demonstrate it by leaving their tents and belongings. And even Moshe announces in from verses 29 to 33 that it says, if these men die as all men die, or if they are visited by the fate of all mankind, then the Eternal has not sent me. But if the Creator creates something new, and the ground opens its mouth and swallows them up with all their belongings, and they go down alive into Sheol, then you shall know that these men have despised the Creator. And as soon as he had finished speaking all these words, the verses describe that the ground under them split apart, split in half, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed all of them up with their households and all the people who belonged to Korah and all their goods. And well, here we can see or we can read that this judgment immediately happened, which took place as stated, obviously just as Moshe said it was going to happen. That's how it took place. The earth swallowed Korah, Datan, and Abiram, along with their descendants, along with their tents and all of their belongings. And on the other hand, the 250 people who approached with the censer were consumed by a fire sent by the Creator. And well, consequently, by order of the Creator, Eliezer takes the censers that had been misused, although they did become something sacred with which the altar would be covered, and it would also be a sign to the children or to the people of Israel for the fact of what had happened. And well, after reading all of this that happened with Korah and with the people of Israel, one would expect obviously a happy, or not a happy ending, but that everyone understood not to rebel against the Eternal, right? And to follow His instructions, His commandments, hoping the best for the people of Israel once everything was confirmed and they had no more doubts. But however, the opposite happened as the people of Israel rose up against Moshe and Aaron, holding them responsible for the death of these people. And in response of all of this negativity, in response of all of this rebellion that the people of Israel had for no reason, in response to this, the Creator immediately sent them a plague that killed thousands of them, and that would not have ended if Aaron had not intercede for the people of Israel. And well, this is what we see in these verses of these two chapters. And something that we can learn obviously from these two chapters is that we should always go according to what the will of the Eternal says. You know, never questioning why He does things or why He chooses certain people, and but rather always being grateful to the Eternal for what He puts in our lives. And obviously never rebel against the Eternal, because Obviously, no, we're not gonna be swallowed up by the earth, or we're not gonna be burned in fire. But however, we are going against what the Eternal says, and well, we don't want to do that because the consequences obviously are not gonna be good. And well, yeah, this is all for today's video. Thank you very much for your time. If you like this video, please give us a thumbs up. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can leave them down in the comment section down below. Once again, thank you very much and have a good one.